G'day viewers, welcome to this Learn Live session, Monitor, Windows Server, IaaS, Virtual Machines and Hybrid Instances. My name's Oren Thomas and I'm in Melbourne, Australia, where it is 9:30 in the morning, and joining me is...
Shannon Keene. Thanks for having me join today.
Cool. Well, Shannon and I are both cloud advocates in Microsoft's DevRel organization. And what cloud advocates do is that we advocate to and on behalf of the audience. And Shannon and I specialize in the IT operations space. Shannon, what do you really like about being a cloud advocate?
I think it's the idea I get a chance to interact with the community and sort of demystify concepts that might be harder to grasp or understand. I think of me as kind of that Sherpa guide, right? Trying to help folks out. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Well, I don't think I'm going to be climbing up Mount Everest anytime soon.
Unless it's a cloud-based Mount Everest.
Yeah, it looks
probably not.
And I mean, the tallest mountain in Australia is one that you can actually, there's a car park about like 150 feet from the summit. So it's a very easy, relaxed way to get up to the tallest mountain on the continent. And that's sort of about as far as I go as a Sherpa. Anyway, the idea of a Learn Live session, and Shannon will go into more of this in a moment, is that people can follow along with MS Learn. Now, also, we're doing this session, and over the course of November and December, there will be a bunch more sessions that are dealing with Windows Server hybrid type topics. And this is tangentially related to a new certification that we've just announced, the Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate Certification. So what we're covering right now, what Shannon and I are going to cover for you over the next hour and a bit, is that we will be covering some of the monitoring stuff. And the monitoring is a big core component of the AZ801 exam. Anyway, Shannon, what I'd love you to do is to tell me a bit more about Microsoft Learn.
Sure. So it's Microsoft's skilling platform. And if you're unfamiliar, it's a great way to go learn a lot about a number of different Azure and also even Microsoft 365. And I think a little bit of some of the server components now as well. It keeps getting bigger and bigger in terms of the amount of modules that are published. So think of it like mixed modalities, right? There's video, there's reading, there's pictures, there's a number of kind of how-tos. Sometimes you get a sandbox, right? So if you don't have an Azure subscription, it's a great way to spin something up and get familiar with some hands-on. So that's basically what Learn is. And this module shows up there for you to take a look at down the road.
Now, Learn material is sort of organized into things called learning paths. And then again, coming back to this stuff around AZ800 and AZ801, there will be, as we lead up to the release of the exam, learning paths published that will actually include all of the modules that are related to the exam objective content, this is of which one is. So you can take an individual module, which is you just pick it up and you do it, or you can take a learning path, which is a series of modules related to a specific topic. In this case, there would be a learning path related to a specific functional group for the exam, which in this case for AZ801 would be troubleshooting and monitoring Windows Server on-prem and hybrid. Okay, so in this particular module, we're going to go through a bunch of different things. We're going to look at how you enable Azure Monitor for VMs, what you can do once you've enabled it, how you go and collect data from Windows Server in a hybrid environment. Because one of the things that we really want to get across to you is that even though a lot of the way that we as Microsoft talk about the cloud seems to be it's all up here or you're only doing it up here, the reality is that most organizations have got a foot in two camps. And that means that cloud and especially monitoring. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the contents of the module. So this presentation maps to the content of the module so that when you go and take the module yourself, you'll go, oh, I remember when Shannon and Oren were making terrible jokes about this part of the module. So, what I'm trying to get at here is part of this module is about you understanding, hey, look, you've got all of this amazing functionality for monitoring and seeing what's going on in your virtual machines in Azure, but you can take all of that functionality and what you can do is you can plug it into the stuff that's running on-prem or in someone else's cloud, and then you get one pane of glass that's telling you all of that cool stuff. So one of the other things that we'll talk about in this is that we'll talk about how you can integrate it with System Center Operations Manager. Now, Shannon, you've been in the business not as long as me because you're, youthful and not, you see, the bald hair, I'm kind of a bit like Captain Picard. I look a lot younger than I actually am. But my son actually pointed out, he said, Papa, did you know that you're actually older than Patrick Stewart was when he did the first episode of The Next Generation? And I went, thanks, kid.
That's a nice reminder. That's a nice reminder.
Yeah. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you is, look, you go back away with operations. Now, what was the first version of Operations Manager did you use? Do you go back to MOM, or are you using System Center Operations Manager, or what was your experience?
It would be SCOM, System Center Operations Manager. So I didn't get into tech until my late 20s. I didn't even go to school for computer science, right? So people often are always asking me, how did you fall into it? And I did by way of being a DJ, right? So that's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, right? But so as a result, I think it was right around 2008, 2007. So that's the SCOM era. And I know of MOM, but I never was around for Microsoft Operations Management.
Yeah. I mean, I played around with it a bit, sort of in that sort of pre-2007 era. So it got renamed, I think, if I remember correctly, it went MOM 2000, MOM 2005, and then it became SCOM when sort of System Center came out as a big umbrella sort of thing. Yep. And I, like a lot of people, sort of got into it because I'd been playing with Configuration Manager, because that's sort of the big kid on the System Center block, especially for the last sort of 15 years.
Agreed.
And then you sort of went, okay, well, I've got System Center Configuration Manager. What else plugs in? And then you've got Operations Manager, Data Protection Manager. You've got Orchestrator. You've got Service Manager, Virtual Machine Manager, all of this sort of stuff. So I was touching it a bit there, and actually had started my career as an instructor-led trainer. By that point, I'd been in sort of the actual doing the job, but I was actually then teaching Operations Manager as well. Now, one of the things that was interesting for me was about 2010, I went to my first Microsoft Management Summit. Did you ever go to the MMS when we actually had conferences that were just about operations?
No, I did not. I did not, unfortunately. It sounds like it was a good time, though, because I've talked to folks who've gone.
It was absolutely in-depth technical, absolutely crunchy stuff, where it was just people really getting down into the weeds of all of the monitoring and operations stuff, and really like 300, 400 level stuff. So it was an amazing experience. I went for the first time, and that was my first time in Vegas. And then I was doing like, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, because the biggest conference that you've got in Australia is about 3,000 people and a couple of sheep, right?
Yeah.
And so you go to Vegas and there's a lot more people. But today, a lot of the community stuff, and it's cloud advocates, we are dealing with the community on a regular basis.
We are.
They're the ones that are actually now running these in-depth conferences that are running at the 300 and the 400 level. Are there any that you can think of that you enjoy presenting at, or that you want to present at, that really cover some of these topics?
That's a good question. I guess, this is the first time I presented at Ignite, so I can check that off, right? But outside of that, gosh, I haven't really thought about it, honestly. I always think that was kind of the pie in the sky, so to speak, the piece that we were always kind of marching toward. And here I am chatting with you, Oren, all the way across the other side of the world.
Isn't it funny that we live in a world where it's completely normal that
Right.
you can co-present with someone who's on the other side of the planet and it
Right,
feels,
right.
absolutely normal. However, if any snakes or kangaroos come in the window, you know what the problem is. There are some great conferences around. There's Minnesota Management Summit, which is sort of apparently, taken on the MMS acronym. And
I
then
heard
that's
of
a
this.
very good community-driven one. There used to be a conference called System Center Universe, which I
Okay.
believe has evolved into Experts Live, which our good friend Thomas Maurer, the biscuit thief, and his partner Isadora Katanik are very much involved in. And they run those all around the world in some form or another. And they have a lot of these topics as well. So if you're as someone who's interested and you've come to Ignite, you've gone, wow, I really want to know more about monitoring and management. I want to go much, much deeper than I'm getting there. There are some really excellent MVP run conferences and third-party run conferences that really get into the weeds about this stuff, because once you start digging into logs, I mean, how can you not enjoy just all of those informational events? All of those warnings, I mean, you could just sit there and talk about them for hours. Can you remember event ID 71412? Anyway, let me hand it back over to you for the next slide.
Sure. So a quick reminder to everybody tuning in. This is a live and interactive session. So if you've got questions, feel free to place them in a chat. We have our fantastic moderators helping us out. So they will be sending answers through to us, and we'll be answering things live over the course of the next hour and 20 minutes, I think is how we're about that amount of time. So definitely feel free to ask a question, shoot it over, and we've also got them answering the chat too. So if they can answer the chat without having to have us go back and forth between multiple different screens, then even better, right? So that's why we always, think of it like we've got folks handling the chat, and then you've got Orrin and I who are the talking heads.
Okay, well, this slide says introduction, and that's all I have to say on this slide. So, Shannon, would you actually like to do the introduction?
Sure. So, you can use Azure Monitor for your virtual machines. And I think a lot of times folks don't really even know what Azure Monitor can do, right? So you can observe performance, diagnostic, and dependency information about Windows Server Infrastructure as a Service VMs. And when you look at that, you think to yourself, okay, I sort of get that it's looking through event logs, it's looking through performance metrics, it's taking a look at different components on the VM itself. Okay, cool. I don't have to bring my monitoring solution on-prem all the way into Azure. Most of my customers, when I was customer facing, they were always having that big debate of, do I move Splunk over? Do I move SolarWinds over, God forbid, or something like that, right? Like just bringing that into the realm of Azure is not always the best reality for customers, because they don't quite know how to sort of get it there. They have to deal with licensing. And this is always that good way to kind of inch into the land of cloud native monitoring.
Now, one of the things that I there's a lot of people who might be aware as Windows Server administrators of bits tangentially, but they might not be on the team that handles monitoring.
Right.
So I find it sort of good to level set and ask a few questions. And I'm going to ask you some dumb questions.
Sure.
And, you can give me dumb answers if you want. But,
hopefully I have an answer to give.
Yeah. I mean, I'll provide you with dumb answers if you want some. So anyway, so within Windows, sort of back in the NT4 days, which was, the deep dark past for some people, we had, and even on the MCSE exams back in the 90s, you used to be literally were questions like, which of the following performance counters would you look at if you wanted to know if your disk were performing badly or something like that?
Right.
But we sort of moved on from just raw performance counters to a thing called data collector sets. So everybody's sort of aware of what Event Viewer is, and data collector sets are sort of something along the lines of Event Viewer, but also telemetry about performance and so on and so forth. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is, look, with Azure Monitor, is it kind of a mix of Event Viewer and data collector sets?
I would think so. You can also monitor the Azure Service Fabric as well. So you can monitor things that are sort of outside the VM as well as inside the VM, which is interesting because I think it's one of the products I can think of that can do those two different layers.
Yeah, I remember, and this was very much part of the Microsoft story when I was an MVP, that we were always talking about the fact that when we were looking at competitors, our competitors they could monitor the fabric, or they could do something at the fabric layer, or that they could go and back up the fabric layer, but they couldn't do what was inside the virtual machine. And that the monitoring story for us is that we were building this sort of end-to-end monitoring story. And our end-to-end monitoring story was not only can you go in with something like application insights or whatever and actually monitor what's going on with a specific application, you can then monitor the operating system that hosts the application, and then you can monitor the fabric that hosts the VM that hosts the application. So that instead of what was happening if you were having a sort of a performance issues, that it wasn't a matter of everybody pointing at one another. The developers pointing at the people that were running the VM and saying, "Well, you're the operating system person. My application is running terribly because your virtual machine settings are wrong. You haven't spec'd this VM correctly." And then the virtual machine administrator sitting there going, "Look, mate, it's not my problem. It is the problem of this bloke over here, who is what he's done is he has not configured the virtualization fabric all that good." Anyway, so what we offer here, and what I think you're sort of saying Azure Monitor does, is that Azure Monitor is absolutely able to sort of give you that end-to-end view of what's going on.
I think so. And you know what's interesting too is Jesper happened to ask us a question too. So Jesper asked, and I can turn this over to you, Oren, because we kind of flipped the script a bit. What is your go-to solution for monitoring hybrid environments? He then goes on to say, I see that SCOM is not used fully. Nevertheless, people are sticking to it. So what have you seen, Oren?
So, and we get back to this later in our presentation. One of the things that's very true about Microsoft's hybrid approach is not dictating to you how you peel the banana. It's all about you finding the solution that works for you. And Shannon and I will go into this a little more later on, but there's a lot of organizations that have built up extremely effective monitoring solutions for their environment. And what we're not trying to tell you here is that if you've got stuff that works, what you need to do is pick it up and chuck it out and replace it with something else. What we're suggesting you do is that you integrate what we've got where it makes sense.
Yeah.
Where it makes sense for you. So your monitoring solution, your monitoring story will be all your story. What we're not trying to do is we're not trying to give you chapter and verse and dogma about how you solve the problem. So there will be organizations, and operations manager isn't going away. There's going to be people who are going to be using that for a long time. And that we're giving them the opportunity, and we'll talk about this, as I said, later on, where you can connect operations manager into this story rather than replacing it. And that, again, when we're coming back to this whole hybrid story that's, a part of the Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification, it's really talking about hybrid cloud is about adding those bits of cloud that make sense for your organization at this point in time. It's not an all or nothing proposition. It's you've got file servers and your file servers are filling up. So one of the ways you can deal with that is turning on Azure File Sync. Turning on Azure File Sync doesn't mean you need to go and run all your virtual machines in the cloud. It just means your on-prem file servers are doing this little bit of cloud thing over here.
Yeah. And it's low-hanging fruit too, right? You don't have to worry about moving everything as is. You can start to dip your toe in and get familiar and comfortable with it. So I think that, at least that's the way I always positioned it when I worked with customers, was you don't have to jump all the way in. There's great integration points.
Yeah, and that's the thing that a lot of customers fear, a lot of IT professionals fear, is that they fear this perception that they've got to jump all of the way into the deep end of the pool,
Right.
and that it's one or the other. And that's not the case at all. It's about you finding the tools that suit you. Azure Monitor is a new toolbox in your monitoring arsenal. And what it does is it integrates with a lot of the other toolboxes that you've already got. You might have Operations Manager, or you might have Splunk, or you might have something else. And it's about how do you plug that in to make what you've got better, rather than asking you to sort of go and buy a whole new thing and hope that the thing that the new thing does is as good as or better than the thing that the old thing do. And once you sort of, cross that Rubicon River, you can't really go back.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the scenario. So the scenario is that we've got that great famous Microsoft company, CONLL101. And today, because CONLL101 is sort of like one of those organizations that might be in the Cayman Islands, and has many hats that they wear at CONLL101. And today they're wearing the medium services, financial services hat, and they're in London with a branch office in New York. Now, have you ever noticed that when we do these scenarios, they're always in like London, Chicago, and New York, which is fine for you because you live in Chicago.
This is true. But I have noticed that. I didn't know if there was a reason.
There is a reason. And I didn't learn this until recently. And what it comes down to is anybody who's read any of my books knows that I like to get a bit creative with the locations I put in my books. So sometimes there's a data center out at Wagga Wagga. Another time there might be one out at Wangaratta. I just go and find the places in Australia, Wollongong, because we've got a lot of places that to American and European ears sound a bit ridiculous. And most of you don't believe Australia is a real place anyway, so it doesn't really matter what I write, right? Anyway, so the reason that we don't, or that when we're looking at an exam specifically, we don't use these unusual place names is that actually makes it very easy to identify a question. So if you're using a unique place name in each question, someone who is breaking the rules and sharing information about the questions going, mate, there was a question about Wagga Wagga, and the answer to the Wagga Wagga question is Azure file sync. So if everything is London, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, no one's sitting there going, oh, did you get the question about Chicago? And it's like, mate, they're all about Chicago.
I didn't realize that. That's actually a smart move. I didn't even realize that was the case. That's an interesting little bit of trivia.
I thought that they were just being boring, but actually there was a good reason behind why they were being boring. That's sort of like I say to my teenager, there's a good reason that parents are boring. It's because that they found out what living life as an exciting person turns out to be. And it usually involves hospital visits or debt. Anyway, so with CONLL101, most of their compute environment runs on premises as Windows Server. Now, this includes virtualized workloads running Windows Server 2012 R2, which is still supported. It's not like they're running Windows Server 2008, which you shouldn't be running. And I know that some of you are. And we're not even going to talk to you, those of you who are still running 2003 or NT, very naughty. Anyway, the IT staff are in the process of migrating their servers to Windows Server 2019. And you might reasonably ask, why are they doing it to 2019 when Windows Server 2022 has come out? And the reality of the way that most IT projects work is that there's a bit of lag time, and that most people don't go and adopt the newest thing away.
It's true.
So a lot of organizations will go, okay, Windows Server 2022's come out. I reckon Windows Server 2019 is not going to have any surprises. So we'll be fine to do that. Anyway, so the rest of the scenario is that we've been asked to conduct further research on how to consolidate and analyze the event log data from all of these virtual machines. Now, learn modules, we try and have some sort of overarching scenario, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to just throw a bunch of facts at you And people don't tend to remember them if they just get the maximum size of a log analytics workspace is X terabytes or so on, right? But if you wrap it up in a nice story, human brains have got a really good way of sort of attaching facts to story. So if you tell a good story, and you see this with politicians, politicians will tell a story when they want you to remember something. We'll tell you a story when we want you to remember something. It'll just be about Contoso. Anyway, Shannon, I think you've now got one of those simple slides.
I do. So we are going to go through the notion or the exercise of enabling Azure Monitor for virtual machines.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you enable Azure Monitor for virtual machines. What Azure Monitor does, as we've said, it's a core component of the Microsoft strategy to extend comprehensive cloud-based monitoring functionality beyond Azure to on-premises data centers and non-Microsoft cloud providers. We got through that slide without using the word synergy, but I'm afraid that we will not get through this presentation without using the word synergy.
I think it shows up later.
I think it does. That's why.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. If you're sitting there at home playing bingo with buzzword bingo, you might get a synergy, but I do not think you'll get an empower. But I might be wrong on that. Anyway, so we can see here on this slide, we've got application operating system, Azure resources, Azure subscription, Azure tenant and custom sources. And that goes back to what Shannon and I were talking about a couple of minutes ago around this idea of holistic monitoring, that you need to go and monitor the entire stack to figure out where things are going wrong. If you've only got sort of a fraction of the story, you don't know exactly what's going on. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, to make a terrible analogy, it's like Star Wars. You watch episode 4 and it kind of stands up by itself, but you don't know who Darth Vader is. You don't know who the Emperor is. The Emperor's not even in that movie, right? To get the whole story, there's a lot more films you need to watch. And then you can go much further down the rabbit hole and read the comic books and the manga and the radio series. Anyway, so what you can do with Azure Monitor is that there's different aspects. You've got the ability to use insights, and insights can tell you about what's going on within an application, what's going on within a container, because of course a lot of applications are now moving to containers rather than just sitting as a sort of a platform as a service application. You can do it at the VM level. You can look at how monitoring solutions are going. You've got the ability with Azure Monitor to visualize stuff, because humans are very visual, and you know, especially people higher up the management chain. The higher up the management chain they go, the more Montessori you've got to get. And
it's true, though. It's true.
Exactly. You give them colors and they're like, you know exactly what you're doing. Whereas if you just give them a slide with a lot of bullet points, they're going,
they're not going to read it. They're not going to read it.
No, they're not. But if there's colors, they're like, well, this person at least looks like what they know what they're doing, because they've got some pretty good graphs going on. So visualization in Azure Monitor will give you dashboards, views. You can plug it into Power BI, and all of us know Power BI wizards and warlocks, and what you choose your type of magic user. I'm not going to go through Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition to choose whether or not it's a
not. We probably don't have time. We probably have time.
Yeah, I mean, I've digressed enough already, and you know, eventually I do get back on track. So then you've got the ability to analyze that data, and we've already got the way of analyzing metrics and log analytics, which is really good, because one of the challenges, and we'll go into this in a little later, is actually understanding what you're looking at. If you're seeing a reading of a disk queue length of X, is X good or is X bad? If you've got a couple of years experience, you know exactly what X is. But if you're coming in and you're monitoring hundreds of VMs or that are all over your environment, sometimes you need to know, is that something that's bad that it's telling me, or is that good? Like there's a little light that's gone on my dashboard on the car. Is that a bad light? Or is that just kind of like an entertainment light? You've got the ability to respond. Now, responding using, for example, alerts. And then you've got the ability to auto scale. So it might be that you're monitoring a workload and you see that the workload's getting overwhelmed. and that you might want to scale that workload up so that it handles things a lot better. So then you've also got the ability to integrate things like logic apps, which is that the logic apps will respond and do something based on what you're seeing. So one of the challenges, and we probably should talk about this now, is the challenge that has always been there with monitoring. Now, in the old days, you had Event Viewer, and you could sit there and generally you had to go onto each machine to look at Event Viewer. So you had to be kind of selective on what you were going to monitor. So one of the things I want to ask you, in terms of your dealing with customers, how big do you build the haystack, right? The amount of straw you get in the haystack depends on how much stuff, the telemetry you're going to pull in. Now, here's the cloud. The cloud's got infinite storage.
Right.
You can ingest everything. So do you ingest everything and let the cloud sort it out?
I guess so. When it always comes down to it, customers might choose to have the cloud ingest everything, but they definitely don't want to be alerted on everything. So I used to always have this conversation of what are some of the big pain points that you want to be aware of before your end users start opening up the floodgates and, calling in or opening up trouble tickets. And so it's usually things like memory, IOPS, CPU utilization. Is that host online or offline? Did a service randomly stop? Right? Those were always kind of the bare bones. And then from there, we wound up kind of massaging some of that data over time because usually the middleware engineers, the folks involved with the application stack, they sort of knew what they needed to monitor, but then you had to communicate that to the folks that were kind of like IT pros, like central IT. And it was always like something got lost in translation. So I always tried to get them to have that conversation of this specific app needs to have IOPS be monitored. That's more important than CPU utilization for some reason, right? Sometimes there's weird workloads like that, right? So having those conversations with each of these mission critical apps usually helped out quite a bit related to what they would wind up monitoring in terms of, how that application would perform over time. I don't know if that matched up to what you saw.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found fascinating about the job is the degree of detective work that it involves.
Yeah.
Because often it is not the thing that you think it is that is causing the problem.
Also true.
I remember one of the apps very early on in my career, I had to look after. It was basically an EDI gateway that was connecting the company I worked for's purchase order system with one of our suppliers. And it would work for 2 weeks and then it suddenly wouldn't work.
Okay.
And then you had to go and reboot the server. And then it worked again. And no one could exactly work out why it would work for exactly 2 weeks and then not work.
Sure.
So I turned on my performance monitor because this is it was actually running on Windows NT4. This is how far back this is. And I'm looking at my metrics and I'm looking at what this application's doing. And over the course of a day, I couldn't see any problem. However, over the course of a week and a half, I saw that the application had a memory leak.
Ooh,
and it was just a really small memory leak.
Yeah.
With a couple of kilobytes every couple of hours, which back in the day when you didn't have all that RAM that you have today, would eventually top out the memory on the server, faff out the page file, and crash the application.
Yeah.
But it was a matter of that detective work of knowing how long do I need to look at something before it becomes apparent what's relevant. So another question around this, and this is again very important in terms of the cloud, is how long should you retain log data?
It's a good question. I guess, so when I used to have these conversations, I always asked things like, are you a regulated company? Do you have to keep your log files and show that you've got your logs files for X amount of days, years, whatever it is? And log analytics, I should have looked this up. I think, is it 90 days? It's a rolling 90 days. Does that sound right to you? Maybe it's, I thought it was maybe it's 60 days.
It depends on which, what you've actually got bought.
Okay.
So there's a basically when you set it up, you can, and we'll come back to that sort of later in one of the demos, but depends what you've got lit up. So if you've actually got Security Center lit up, it actually changes what your free period is.
It does. Yeah, it does.
So you've got a free period and then you've got a paid period. And then you've got a lot of other options that we'll sort of talk about in the demo. But of course, you've got to make decisions around this. It's, how long do I actually bother to keep this stuff? And this is also important from another perspective, which is the security perspective. And what I mean by that is that a lot of security events can only be detected by looking at the data that's coming in from your monitoring solutions.
It's true.
One of the biggest sort of breaches in history was one with a big US retailer. And what had happened was that the attackers had come in, and the attackers had got in, I think it was about March of the year that the attack happened. And they'd got in and then they'd maintained persistence, which is you get in and you find a nice perch somewhere in the network to sit, and then you just go and look at what's going on the network. And these attackers were very smart people, because what they did is they understood how this retailer's operations work. They looked around and they went, okay, so what this retailer's doing is every night, what they're doing is they're dropping a new operating system on every register in North America.
Okay.
That is Canada and the United States. And they're sort of sitting there going, okay, so let's look at their monitoring solution. What storage controllers have they got? Okay, they're using these particular storage controllers. Okay, so how are the images actually built? And there was an automated image build process that was going on an image build server. So this particular retailer kept logs for a long time because the attack itself wasn't launched until Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Which, again, as I think it's November, because we obviously...
It is November, and yeah.
Yeah, when you come from a country that was sort of set up as a penal colony, there wasn't a lot of people that were really giving thanks about being sent. Although if you ask an English person, again, the thing is that you ask someone from England, it's like, my ancestors were punished by being sent to somewhere that's got, sun and good beaches, and your ancestors were rewarded for, behaving, and they got to stay in the United Kingdom. Anyway, so what they found was, and the attack was really sophisticated. So what the attackers did in that particular instance is the attackers actually came up with a way of poisoning the image construction process. Okay. So that each time the operating system image was built for the registers, they were injecting malware that would capture credit card data that was being put in through there. Okay. So there's a security mitigation for, one of our registers might get infected. It doesn't matter because it's getting wiped every day. It was, we're going to infect the operating system image build process and then drop the malware into the image and then have you drop the image to every register in North America. But we're going to wait until a day or two before Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, because that's the biggest trading day, before we do it. And then what we're going to do is we've looked around your network and we've looked through your operations log and we've seen what generates alerts. So we're going to make the alert in your operations log that this thing is going to throw, this malware is going to, when detected by your security solution, is going to make it look like a Dell storage driver. So we're going to launch the attack just before the Thanksgiving retail thing, so that you've got to make the call. If you're looking through your logs and your security logs and you're suddenly seeing all of these alerts turn up about a storage controller that that's on your network, are you going to go and turn off every register before the worst trading day of the year, or are you going to let it go? Now, where this comes back to log retention is that the people who were investigating this were able to piece all of this story together because they had enough data going right back to when the initial penetration of the network occurred, so that they're able to piece together things going forward. But if you're only keeping your log data for some things for 7 days and someone's had persistence for longer than 7 days, you're never going to know when they got into your network.
It's true.
Anyway, so let's get into one of your slides. What's Azure
Sure.
Monitor?
Sure. Yeah. So, you can use Azure Monitor to optimize administration of your existing deployments and forecast capacity requirements for future deployments, which I think is kind of cool. You would expect this out of a monitoring solution, but you get that nice little extra piece here so you can think about forecasting. So, there are three capabilities that are outlined here on the slide. It's monitoring and metrics visualization. So going back to what Oren was talking through related to Power BI's, dashboards, et cetera. Metrics are captured as numerical values, and those numerical values can be translated into graphs, charts, all of these great visuals, right? So I think that helps, especially if you're trying to showcase what you're monitoring and why, as it sort of moves up the proverbial ladder, getting closer to the C-suite of folks, right? That usually helps them out. Oh gosh, they're monitoring all of this. Great. Good job, right? Then you got the ability to query and analyze logs. And so the log analytics component, we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's what sort of grabs all those logs or allows you to collect those logs and query those logs. So that helps you with setting up alerts, looking at telemetry over time, trying to piece together what happened. I think that's really helpful from an investigation perspective. And you use the same querying capabilities with monitoring as you do with security. So it's interesting to pay attention to that realm. And then there's alerting and remediation, right? So you can set up alerts to have certain things be sent to you via email, via text message, right? You can also set up remediation tactics. So you could set up some sort of webhook. You could set up an actual automated process that happens. I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head, and it's been a bit since I've had to think this one through. Usually the harder thing is what sort of alerts do you want to set up and what do you want to get alerted on? But the automation side usually kind of comes about once you have everything sort of set up from that alerting perspective, right? You want to get a good handle on everything that could be potentially alerted on.
It's always, especially when you're setting up automation that's triggered by alerts, it's always a lot like those Looney Tunes cartoons or the Warner Brothers cartoons with Roadrunner and Coyote, where Coyote would go and set up all of this elaborate things. And let's say Roadrunner was the thing setting off the alert, and then all of this stuff would happen.
Right.
And of course, it would be Coyote that would end up then being chucked over into the cliff. So always be careful where you set up your automation.
Yeah, you might have some unintended consequences.
Yes, your career limiting events. Okay, so let's talk about the monitoring the VMs. So Azure Monitor for VMs enable you to monitor your Windows Server IaaS VMs. And we'll talk a little bit about all of this sort of applies to your hybrid VMs as well. So you've got log analytics, you've got, and when you set up a log analytics, and you'll see us go and do this, you configure the workspace for Azure Monitor for VMs. The monitor currently supports log analytics workspace only in specific regions. And basically there's documentation that'll go into that. Now, supported operating systems are basically Microsoft supported operating systems. And at the moment, we do support Windows Server 2008 R2. And the reason for that is that some of you might have noticed when we came to end of support for Windows Server 2008 R2, we did actually offer customers extended support for that operating system if they were running it in Azure.
Right.
So, of course, that means that it's fully supported for monitoring of VMs. So the next thing is the dependency agent. And what the dependency agent does is it provides data to map the feature to the map feature of Azure Monitor for VMs. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to see what the dependencies are on this VM and what this VM depends on. So if you've got a multi-tier, multi-VM application and you want to know, okay, what does this depend on? Well, if the domain, if you've got like a micro domain or something like that, and it needs that for authentication, well, that's a dependency. And if you turn off the domain controller VM, you're going to be in a world of hurt later on. Or if the VM's dependent on, for example, a DHCP server to get its IP address, or it's dependent on a SQL server that actually hosts the database that the application's using, all of that will show up in this map feature. It also relies on the log analytics agent to connect to log analytics. It also tells you, now the other thing you need to understand is from a security perspective, that always use principle of least privilege, in that you don't need to be sitting there as the equivalent of an Azure domain admin to go and set this up. There's actually a role called the log analytics contributor role, that if you give someone that role, they've got the appropriate permissions to go and deal with and how you set this up. And this is very important, because remember that the telemetry that's been collected here by this agent actually might contain some sensitive information that you don't want going out into the rest of the world. And any attacker who's attacking your network is trying to spider their way up. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a sort of an account that's just used by a sort of a tier 1 help desk person who's maybe doing server support or something like that.
Right.
And they're setting up agents, and then they've suddenly got, you know, a global administrator role on the actual Azure subscription. Oops, Daisy. Where were we? There we go. Okay, so Shannon. Tell me about monitoring for a single VM.
So we'll kind of talk this through at a high level. So you go pick that VM in the portal, and then you will install the Azure Monitor for VMs map dependency agent. You'll select Insights under monitoring, and you will select Enable. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? I think we'll set up the stage for a demo later on that kind of showcases this, but at a high level, it's just a handful of steps, you know, and you can do this inside the actual portal itself. You can do this via any of the automated ways. So PowerShell, the CLI, I believe you can even enable this with an ARM template. I'm not positive. I haven't tried to take a look at this. I know you can, though, with PowerShell and the Azure CLI. So if you'd rather do that, then go to the portal, because it's, you know, sometimes people get more familiar doing that, right? That's also an option for you.
Absolutely. And I think you can do it with Azure Arc. Now,
oh, yes, you can.
So what's the biggest mistake that you and I have both made when we've been sitting there preparing a demo?
So you want to make, so you want to make sure your VM is on. If your VM is off, and let's say you have Azure Automation powering your VMs off because you thought this was a nifty, neat tool, and it is, but you didn't necessarily remember that the servers you were trying to enable this on were off because your automation already ran, that's where this can be kind of squirrely, right? Where you're like, why did that not work? And then you spend forever troubleshooting it, and you take a look at the VM itself, and it's pretty obvious it's not on. But that's, you know, that's something you do down the road in your list of troubleshooting and kind of your checklist.
Yes, because it's always the thing that you go, I'm not stupid enough to not have done that.
And then you're like, oh, it was me. I powered it off.
IP operations is often a lesson in humility about assumptions.
It's true.
And it's sort of like that, you know, absolute wisdom is, you know, I know that I know nothing. Review your monitored data. Okay, so you can see here that we've got a whole lot of information. We've got a map going, and you'll see a version of this when we go through the demo. And part of it's a bit like running NetStat. So you won't be able to see because this is way, way, way too small. But, you know, here we've got port 80 with 5 servers connected to it. Port 443 has 13 servers connected to it, and port 138 has 1 server. Now, once you've enabled monitoring, you can look through the following. You can see more details about a specific item. You can go in and jump into log events. You can go and look at the alerts that have been generated from level 0 through to level 4, and you can see all active connections to the VM. So a bit of a digression. We've all been there where we've set up alerts, but how do you know what alerts you should set up to notify you?
So in my own experience, I only want to be alerted about things that aren't working correctly. I don't even care as much about warnings. Usually warnings will be something I look at as an investigative after the fact. Like, when did this start to hit that warning level? But it's, for me, always the errors, right? Like when something doesn't work as expected, a VM's down, IOPS are high, CPU's overutilized, right? That's when I want to get the alerts. I don't know if you're like me, because I feel like there's a ton of events that get generated. I don't care as much about that. It's nice to see that they're there, but I probably don't want to get alerted on it, right?
No, well, I used to, look, the way that you can tell how long someone's been doing this job is how many emails they get from an automated alert system, right? Because a lot of people sit there and when they're a bit green behind the ears or wet behind the, I don't know what the bloody term
I think it's wet behind the ears is the right. I
yeah,
think.
when they're a bit new.
Yeah, they're young.
When
They're young.
When they're young and a bit, unfortunately, to use your surname, keen. When they haven't had that sandpaper of actually working in the real world grind them down a bit, they might want to have an alert for everything.
Yes.
But what happens very quickly is that they then create a rule in Outlook that diverts all of those alerts to a folder. And they might start off with the best of intentions of looking through that folder, but we all know that in the end, all they do is they right-click mark as read or select all, press delete, and that they end up not dealing with it. So you've got to be careful when you're setting up alerts. And the one I used to sort of go with, 15 years ago, my standard joke was never set up an alert that if it went off at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't want to be woken up by it, right?
Yeah,
so
true.
If you want an alert to be sent to you, like especially back in the old days where you used to sort of get them sent to your phone, and you could set up like an SMS gateway, so that you could. That's how keen you were. I'm going to get alerts sent to my phone, so I can be sitting down with the family, and I can be told that Exchange has gone kaput.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, in the case of Exchange going kaput, when it, not that it ever does that, that you would you'd get notified about it, and then you get in the car and you drive down to the data center and you go and do something about it. Anyway, so you've got a slide that's just a single slide.
Yeah, so we're at the exercise part. So this is always the fun part, right? And if you take this module online, you will get a chance to watch how this is done as well. But all of the exercises are usually more hands-on, or you're watching a video tutorial.
So and when you watch it online, this will be narrated for you by another cloud advocate. He's got a problem with stealing people's sweets. That should tell you exactly who it is. If you know the broader narrative of cloud advocacy and the theft of cakes, you know exactly who we're talking about. And we're not buying people cats. Anyway, so now that I've done my duty, Isadora, what we will be doing in this particular demo is that we're going to be basically turning on monitoring for an IaaS VM. So let's start walking through the demo. So here we are, and we're starting in the VM's properties page on the overview tab. So what we'll do is that we will scroll down and we're going to click on Go to Insights. We click on Go to Insights. And here we've got the Enable button. So we click on Enable to enable Insights. Now, what do I need to remember to have done before I get to this point, Shannon?
You want to make sure your VM's on.
Absolutely. Okay. So what we do here is that we're actually going to configure which Log Analytics workspace is actually going to ingest all of this data. So here we're going to go and select Contoso Workspace 42. And then we go and click Enable. Now, what will happen then is it will go off and do this. And through the magic of television, we've sort of compressed time here. And what we've got here is that we've actually got the map that you can see, and we had a version of this on a previous slide, where you could see that there are 8 servers connected via port 443, and that we can see what's actually going on with this. Now, this will not turn up immediately. It'll take a little time to come up. But what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to suddenly see, what is this VM interacting with? It's not an island. There's other things going across.
Right, right.
So the next thing we can do is that we can jump across to the performance node. And we're in the performance node here. And we can use this, for example, to determine what memory, disk, processor utilization is for the VM. And the real advantage here is that we can do it without having to remote desktop into the virtual machine. So if you get a call from someone in your organization and they go, this virtual machine that you've got running my application on is not, the application's running terribly. Rather than spinning up Bastion or RDP and going in and looking at the VM itself, you can come into the Azure console. So at the fabric layer, you've got this dashboard that'll actually show you everything that's going on inside that particular VM. Whoops, that's not the one I wanted. Okay, so we've got a knowledge check. So the idea is that Shannon and I are going to go through these questions. You can answer in Pubble if you want. So, Shannon, do you want to ask the question?
Sure. So what's the purpose of the log analytics workspace that you just created inside the demo, Oren? Do you know?
No, because I just followed the instructions, and it's like IKEA, isn't it? That you just follow the instructions and you have no idea what's going on, and suddenly you've got a bookcase.
Well, let's go through the answers. Maybe we could by the power of two, maybe we could figure out what the answer is.
I hope so. Anyway, so is it C? Okay, the log analytics workspace is used to retrieve monitoring settings to the VM. Does that sound like something the log analytics workspace would do?
I mean, kind of, but I don't know if I don't know. I'm not convinced. We may need to go. Maybe it may need to come back. It could be that one, but we may need to come back to it. And in true Microsoft form, we might want to look at all of the potential
all of the options. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the challenges of course, is that we as a company keep renaming this thing. So, what is the difference between log analytics and Azure Monitor, Shannon?
So I think of it like this. Azure Monitor is sort of like the umbrella service. It sits over Log Analytics and it sits over Application Insights. And Log Analytics is the resource you deploy and you link up to Azure Monitor. You can see all the Azure Monitor logs, and then Log Analytics also gets logs sent to it too. So it's an interesting relationship. They're like siblings, maybe is probably the way I would describe it. They're related. They're not identical, but they're probably siblings. That's probably the best way I could describe it.
And what was OMS?
Well, OMS used to be sort of like what System Center was. It was like 5 or 6 different things. It was Azure Automation, it was Log Analytics, it was Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup, and then there was the security component, which it wasn't Azure Security Center. It was just security. I can't remember what it was the security piece. I can't remember what it was called. And then they started picking apart the different services and they became kind of standalone services. So Operations Management Suite, or OMS, was essentially sunset.
Okay, yeah, it can be a bit challenging to keep up with all of the names, and even those of us with blue badges have challenges doing this. So the Log Analytics workspace is used to define who has access to the logged data. Well, is it the Log Analytics workspace that defines that, or is it the permissions on the workspace?
I'd say it's the permissions on the workspace. So but again, it's sneaky enough that if you had to probably read that twice.
Yes. So, and according to Sherlock Holmes, once you eliminate the impossible or the improbable, all that's left is whatever's left. And in that case, it happens to be A, which is the Log Analytics workspace, stores all the data from monitoring. And as we know, it is the big bucket that stores all of that information.
Yes.
Right. So Simon says, answer A. Okay. So
now we're on to hybrid scenarios, Oren. We're taking this kind of one step further. So we'll go ahead and we'll enable Azure Monitor in a hybrid scenario next.
So, okay, so one of the things that we've sort of talked about here is the idea of how in a hybrid environment, you can plug in services, in this case, Azure Monitor, to make things better. Now, one of the things I really like is the idea of a cloud monitoring platform, especially as someone who's managed on-premises instances of things like Operations Manager, is you sort of go in and put your solution in on-prem, and then you're constrained by what the solution does. Like Operations Manager itself or Service Manager had some system requirements, and if you wanted to do any complex analysis, or you were always constrained by how much you could store, what the database could do, and all of that. when you are moving to a cloud platform, what you're getting is you're getting this level of continuous improvement in the platform, so that the capacity is always extending, and what it can do is always becoming better. And one of the ways that I also like to think of this, and this is more on the security side of the fence, is that with the cloud platform, everything that Microsoft knows, like the workbooks that allow you to sort of view interesting data and interesting things that you might not know about, because there is more that you don't know about your systems than probably you do, because it's a great,
Yep.
great, amazing thing. And even if you've been in the job 30 years, you'll sit there and go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that that bit of telemetry indicated or would be causing that particular problem. But this sort of communal wisdom can be built into a cloud platform. And once the communal wisdom is understood one place, it can be spread against all of these other things. So suddenly you can get a new alert that might be generated for you based on something that Microsoft has learned from one of its customers, or one of its engineers has learned about a particular system, and then you can learn it. So one of the advantages of this idea of moving the management layer up to the cloud is that it makes it very easy to manage and monitor across very diverse geographic environments. Like a lot of organizations have got branch offices in a lot of spaces, and especially when you are setting up things like operations manager, if you had, let's say, a branch office in Melbourne, you had one in Chicago, and you had one in Cairo, would you go out and have one instance of operations manager, or would you go and put operations manager in each of those locations?
You probably would have put them in each location, right? Because you probably wouldn't think about maybe having it go to one specific spot. At least in the customers I've worked with. I mean, I'm sure there might be a customer out there that has centralized spot for all log data, but time is of the essence. Sometimes you might have a couple more hops if you have to go to Cairo versus something that's like locally close to you. So I don't know if that matches up to what you've seen over the years supporting customers or working with customers.
I've seen the craziest stuff.
I'm sure.
Yeah, look, it really depends on the organization. I've seen some organizations that did it globally. I know some companies where their entire operation in Australia, because they were an Asia Pacific organization, they didn't have any domain controllers or file servers on the continent. All their file servers and domain controllers were sitting in a data center in Singapore until the compliance regulations changed, and then suddenly they had to keep their file servers and authentication servers on Aussie soil, because that was what the requirement was. And then there was other customers who were each part of the world had its own team. The teams didn't really talk to one another, and there were multiple forests in each thing, and they sort of had trust relationships, but no one was getting in anybody else's Wheaties. Okay, so tell me about implementing Azure Monitor in hybrid scenarios.
So you'll want to make sure that you go in to your log analytics workspace and you want to select the advanced settings. So you have to install the log analytics agent on the server on-prem or in your hybrid scenario in order to get that data sent to Azure Monitor. So if you go in to the log analytics workspace, you go to the advanced settings, you get the workspace ID and the primary key. You wind up using those during the installation. And then in the details pane, you have download links. So you can download the 64-bit and you can download the 32-bit. And at some point, we'll no longer have 32-bit servers, but we still have them. So we still have to have a 32-bit version of this for those customers.
Now, this slide's interesting for one reason. This course was written probably about 6 months ago. And here we're talking about the log analytics agent. But I keep hearing about an Azure Monitor agent. What on earth is the difference?
Yeah. So I think the monitoring team has finally realized we probably need to consolidate and have one something versus multiple somethings, right? So In very short order here, depending upon what you have deployed in your environment, you'll be able to just install the Azure Monitor agent. It's fully GA. However, not everything is like for like just yet, and I suspect that's going to continue to evolve and change and take shape. But if you have a scenario where you do need log analytics and you do need the dependency agent because there's some different component inside of Azure that is not yet capable to be handled by the Azure Monitor agent, it doesn't hurt to go through this course just so you're familiar with what it looks like.
Now, let me just move to the next slide. Log Analytics Workspace. All the data collected by both Log Analytics and the dependency agent in a hybrid environment is uploaded automatically to your Log Analytics Workspace, which is optimally in the region physically closest to the location hosting your on-prem data center. Now, it says here you can create multiple workspaces in the same subscription. Why would I want to create multiple workspaces?
So I can think of a handful of customers I've worked with who had things like GDPR working sort of against them. They were heavily regulated. They needed to have log data in specific areas show up in that specific region. Outside of that, maybe there was a reason to have multiple workspaces. At one point, permissions weren't great. So if you wanted to have more granular permissions, you sometimes had to have multiple workspaces. But now there's these great new permissions, or new-ish permissions. Are about 2 years old. So they're I guess they're not as new, but there are some customers who have some older instances out there. So if you redeploy, or if you deploy net new and you pick the per gigabyte SKU, you're able to change things in the workspace related to permissions. So you don't necessarily have to have multiple workspaces, but there might still be a need, right? And the one I can think of always at top of mind is those customers that are heavily regulated that might need to have log data that's in a specific region go to a specific workspace.
And from the perspective of the pragmatic operations person, one of the things I like to point out to people is that we can talk about the ability to do very granular permissions on a resource, but you only have to look at the way that permissions are configured on file shares to know that most people couldn't configure permissions if you stapled them to them. So sometimes it actually makes more sense to just configure separate resources and do blunt force permissions at the resource level and say that group 1 has permission to this resource and group 2 has permission to this resource, rather than trying to tangle it up. Because even though you can do a thing, doesn't mean that people will competently do a thing.
It's true. It's true.
So one of the things that I always try to bring people back, and again, this is part of the role of the cloud advocate, is the cloud advocate is to speak a level of truth, in that you've got to be honest about there's what you can do and there's what people actually do. What you should do is you should use a group managed service account for your service accounts on Windows Server instances. What you should not do is and that you should delegate the appropriate permissions to that service account. What you should not do is go, I'm just going to create a user account, call it service account, and put it in the domain admins group, and then I don't have to worry about it.
You don't want to do that? I'm kidding.
No, but you would be surprised at the number of people.
I know. And there's a lot of levels of interpretation as well. So
don't feel bad if you're a consultant or if you're out there working there and you say, look, I can come up with a solution that is technically elegant, but might not actually stay that way. Or I can come up with something that's a bit more blunt, but actually will absolutely get the job done.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about using Windows Admin Center.
Sure. So you can integrate Windows servers with Azure Monitor by using Windows Admin Center. So, there's this great integration point now that is a fantastic way to think about onboarding your servers on premises to Azure Monitor. So you need to register the Windows Admin Center with Azure first, but that's fairly straightforward. And it's something that is just a handful of clicks or a handful of configurations, and you're able to then onboard the servers to Azure Monitor.
Now, coming back again to this hybrid administrator associate story that we're telling, Windows Admin Center is absolutely one of these technologies that you as a hybrid administrator should be all over like a bad shirt. It is going to be, and we've said this for a couple of years, all new functionality in Windows Server, including the hybrid stuff, is going to be surfaced in Windows Admin Center.
Right.
What you're not going to see is not going to see a new node in Server Manager or in Active Directory users and computers that allows you to go and connect it to Azure.
Yeah.
It's all going to be through Windows Admin Center. And all of this extra functionality, your GUI for managing it. And the advantage of Windows Admin Center is it's a very remote first paradigm. That is that you can use Windows Admin Center to manage your on-prem instances of Windows Server, or you can connect it through a VPN or an express route connection to go and manage your VMs that are actually running in Azure.
Okay.
Okay, so
we're going to do another exercise, Oren.
We are
going to collect data from a Windows server sitting on prem.
Okay, so what we're going to do here, and just let me get it set up. What we've got here is we have got the Azure console that everybody is all familiar with. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and create a log analytics workspace. So we click on log analytics workspace, we click add, and what we need to do is give it a unique name within the subscription. Now, when you're configuring a log analytics workspace, you have to go and choose where you're going to go and put it. So we give it the unique name. Now, what should we be thinking about in terms of where we put a workspace?
You're going to want to place it in the closest proximity to where the bulk of your workloads are. So if you are in New York, you probably would pick East US or East US 2.
That's part of it. And also remember that increasingly we are seeing these requirements around data sovereignty.
Yes.
And you want to make sure that if you're explaining to an auditor, let's say that you've got a bunch of file servers that are hosting medical data on them, and that you've got these file servers connected to a log analytics workspace. Well, if they've got medical data on them, and even though the files themselves aren't replicating to a foreign geolocation, do you want to get into the argument with the auditor about that, or is it easier just to make sure that
it's easier to make sure it's done ahead of time, because nobody wants to pay that penalty. Nobody wants to deal with an auditor. So yeah, no, I agree. That's the other time where you'd probably want to make sure that the region you pick is in the right data sovereign region.
Yeah. So again, remember, sometimes best practice is pragmatism rather than what is technically elegant. Right. Okay. So the next thing we do is, we're just going to put it in the US because this was a US-based demo, even though it was done by a Swiss cake thief. Okay, so we specify our pricing tier. Now, here we're going to go as pay-as-you-go, and that's where you're doing it on a per gigabyte data. Now, you've got the option of actually doing and saying, I'm going to use a certain number of gigabytes per day. So if you're using only a small amount of data, it probably makes a lot more sense to actually just go with pay as you go. But if, let's say that you're doing 100 gigabytes of data per day, you can actually get a discount that's like 20% off your fee, as opposed to using it as pay as you go. If you are using 5,000 gigabytes per day, and you know that you're going to be ingesting or using that much data in your log analytics workspace, which is, not an insubstantial amount of data.
Right, right.
And you can choose a 5,000 gigabytes per day pricing tier that will give you about 35% of a discount over pay as you go. So it's worth, when you start off, and this is one of the things when you're coming back and looking at what your solution is that the solution that you choose when you're spinning up a project might not exactly be the solution that you want to use 2 years into the project. And everybody who's on this has been in the case where they've actually they've put a workload up in test environment, and then suddenly, through the magic of the wish fairy, that test workload has become business critical production.
Yep.
Absolutely. So now the other thing that you can consider at this point is your log data retention. So we were talking about this a little earlier, and by default, it's 31 days if you haven't got Security Center, or Sentinel. If you turn on Sentinel, you get 90 days. and 90 days for application insights data. After that, you're looking at about 10, 12 cents per gigabyte per month. The other thing that you can do is that you can set up log data export. So you can take all of that log data and you can move it out of the log analytics workspace and you can go and dump it in cold storage. So there's an export data cost of around $0.123 per gigabyte, but then you can go and store it somewhere that's much cheaper than actually just storing it on a per monthly basis, because then you're just not paying for that sort of thing. So, okay, so here we're just going with pay as you go. So what we're going to do is click review and create. It does a check to see that everything's actually fine there. And then we click create and it goes and creates the workspace. So through the magic of television, we're going to speed that up. And we can see that that's now created. And now we're going to go to the resource. Now, once we've got our resources, we need to go down to do something about installing agents. So we go to agents management. Now we can do Windows Server agents or Linux servers. This is obviously a Windows Server focused module, so we're going to be doing Windows Server. And as you mentioned earlier, we've got the option of going 64-bit or 32-bit. You're pretty much going to go 64-bit because I think the last version of Windows Server that was 32-bit was Windows Server 2003. And you're probably not going to be connecting that to Azure, although I did hear about one customer who did something really creative where they enabled nested virtualization, I think, on Windows Server 2019 so that they could run a Windows Server 2008 host where they enabled virtualization on that so that they could run Windows Server 2003. So that was sort of matryoshka insanity, but that's what they did. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to download the agent. Now, what this will do is it'll just download it to the local workstation. Now, anybody who is worth their salt as a systems administrator is not running this browser on the server that they want to install the agent on, are they? No.
No, but I think we are for the demo, right?
Oh, yeah, because demos are you're always logged in as an administrator and you're always logged in as you're a global administrator. But let's pretend that Shannon and I are very well-behaved children and we're not doing that. But what you'd be doing is you'd download it to a file share and then you'd be going across to the server and then you'd be mounting that file share and doing that. Because one of the other things that you want to make sure you never do, or one of the things, no, that's probably more of a best practice, and we can actually see it on this screen here. It's about the Log Analytics Gateway. One of the easiest ways to secure your stuff is to block a lot of servers that are sitting on an internal network from communicating with the internet at all.
Right.
If you've got a domain controller, why does your DC need to go and talk to the internet?
Yeah.
It doesn't, probably.
No.
If you've got a lot of your internal infrastructure servers, so your firewall rules should be configured to say, no, you can't go and do that. And you can use a Log Analytics Gateway as a proxy. And you set up the Log Analytics Gateway proxy so that you've got this proxy system that's sitting on your sort of your perimeter network. And that's the thing that's communicating through to Azure. So we move. We move on. So we then are going to copy the workspace ID, and that's a nice juicy GUID. We're just going to run the wizard. So we're just running this on a 2019 box. So we accept the default install location. So one of the other options that we've got here is you can see with this installation that you automatically do have the option of connecting it both to Azure Log Analytics and not exclusively or System Center Operations Manager. So all we're going to do here is connect it to Log Analytics. So we select that option. We click next. Now we need to provide that workspace ID. So we already went and copied it into our buffer. Now the next thing we need is a workspace key. So we copy the workspace key and we paste it in. Now you'll have noticed on that workspace key page that there was two workspace keys that we had. We had a primary and a secondary. Now, why do we have that, Shannon?
It's to secure the log traffic going into Azure and to sort of link it together with the log analytics workspace.
Now, why is it a good idea to rotate those keys?
So that, because they're kind of like master keys, they're sort of like your storage keys, right? You want to, over time, regenerate those keys because that's how this gets installed. You may not want to have an attacker come in and potentially figure out those keys, right? So I do think, actually, I don't know how it's all the way installed, but there might be a way to exploit those keys. So it's just good practice to regenerate those keys.
Well, yeah, and the way that you do that is that basically you've got a primary and a secondary. So when you first set it up, every server that you're doing has got the primary key. And then, a couple of months later, what you do is you migrate all of the agents across to the secondary key. Once they're all on the secondary key, what you do is you regenerate the primary key. And that means that that primary key is no longer valid. So if that key is out there and exposed, it's no longer relevant. And then a couple of months later, what you do is then you migrate them off the secondary key back to the primary key. Once they're all migrated across, you rotate the secondary key. So if that key's been exposed, rinse, repeat, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, ad absurdum. Okay, so we've got to put that in, and you can select your cloud. Now, 99.9% of you are just going to select Azure Commercial because that's your bog standard cloud. But if you're in another geo or you're in a government, it might be something else. You've also got the option of having the agent automatically update. That's generally a good idea unless, again, there's reasons why you want to be pretty static about the way that that configuration works. So what we do now is we come into the workspace settings. And what we're going to do here is we're going to set up what data is actually going to be ingested by the agent. So here we're saying, okay, let's take our system, and we've got our system log, and we can choose the system event log. Do we want to do everything, which is error, warning, and information? Or are we just sort of sitting there and going, you know what? Probably don't need the information stuff. Let's just take the error and the warning stuff. Or, again, it used to be at one stage you go and look at Event Viewer. And if there weren't too many red ones, you were good. And if there are a bunch of yellow ones, well, they're not red. So let's ignore those. And the white ones you don't worry about at all. Anyway, not that that's good practice, but I'm just saying what a lot of people do. There's a lot of cowboy systems and administration in Australia. So here you're selecting which performance counters you actually want to ingest. So again, the default is 10 seconds. So I would go with the default. There's probably no need to have per second performance counter data getting ingested into log analytics. Yeah. And this is going to go and apply across all of your agents that are connected to that workspace. So we can then go and jump into the logs. Okay, so we can go and write a query. Now, what's the language that we're using there? Shannon?
We are using the Custo query language.
Right. So here we're just doing a very simple query, and we're just looking at performance. But there is a whole set of Jedi skills related to doing this, where you can actually pull some extraordinary data out. And we can see the results there of our performance data. So we can then sort of drill down into some of that stuff, such as network interface, memory, logical disk, and so on. Okay, we have another knowledge check.
Okay, so when preparing a server's host for monitoring, what does an administrator do on the agents management page in the demo?
Okay, so what do we do? Well, again, this was were you paying attention to the demo? So, did we regenerate the primary key?
No, we didn't.
Did we regenerate the secondary key?
We did not.
So by the process of elimination, what did we do?
We downloaded the appropriate agent for the VM. So B.
Absolutely. Okay, so here we've got integrating Azure Monitor with System Center Operations Manager. So as we said earlier, and we sort of had this come up earlier in the talk, you've got System Center Operations Manager on-prem. You can integrate it with Azure Monitor. You don't need to replace it. There's going to be a lot of customers out there that have very effective SCOM deployments, and they might even have them connected to other things. SCOM comes with management packs. What's some of the tricks that you've learned about tuning management packs, Shannon?
That I think each one requires a bit of tuning. Each one requires a bit of time and consideration based upon whatever pack you're installing.
Now, absolutely correct, because some management packs are like a fire hose and they will tell you absolutely everything, and some might be a bit parsimonious with what they go and tell you.
So
okay.
we've got synergy on the slide. So yeah, so you're able to integrate Azure Monitor with Operations Manager. This will build that synergy between the services, right? So you can configure a Windows agent to report to one or more workspaces, even when it's reporting to an Operations Manager management group. So that's kind of cool. Gives you some extra flexibility here. So you sort of extend what you're doing on-prem, you bring about Azure Monitor, and then you can have it report to multiple spots. And I think we are getting close on time, Oren. I don't know if you want to.
Okay, well, we've got only one or two slides left. So in terms of implementing Azure Monitor integration with Operations Manager, what you need to do is basically integrate with a log analytics workspace. You must register Operations Manager Management Suite. So again, some of the older names and terminology here using the OMS onboarding wizard, which is available from the Operations Manager console. You're likely wanting to do this because you've simply got a whole lot of stuff that depends on SCOM. There's organizations that, as we said, had very complicated setups and automations. For example, I know of one organization that triggered SCOM, had SCOM alerts, trigger orchestrator automation that creates a job in Service Manager. They were all in with System Center. That then triggers another orchestrator automation that ran a job in Data Protection Manager, or another job in Virtual Machine Manager. There was one organization that I knew that literally monitored the number of Exchange mailboxes on an Exchange mailbox server. And once they reached a certain size, they automatically span up a new mailbox server and then migrated half of the mailboxes across to the other mailbox server. Now, it's likely that automated responses to alerts are going to be set up with whatever works best for your organization. And for a lot of organizations, responding to on-prem events is something that you handle on-prem. Handling Azure stuff is something that you handle in Azure, but you figure out what works for you. On-prem Microsoft technologies are going to increasingly integrate with Azure, but do not and will not require Azure to function. Azure, as I've said, and as Shannon said, is just another toolbox that works in conjunction with your on-prem toolbox. Okay.
So, knowledge check.
Okay. Sonia at Contoso has been tasked with enabling Azure Monitor on an on-prem VM workload. What information? Oh, this is Sonia. I should have changed Maria to Sonia there. Need to complete the process of installing the log analytics agent.
So if I watch the demo correctly, I don't think A is right, because that's not the only thing Sonia needs. And I don't think B is right, because that's not the only thing Sonia needs. I think she needs C. She needs needs to pick C. She needs both the workspace ID and the primary key.
Absolutely correct. And we're almost done. Sonia needs to enable monitoring in a VM in Azure that's running Windows Server. She opens the portal, navigates to the required VM and selects the Insight page, but she cannot enable monitoring. What's the most likely reason that Sonia can't do this? And we've talked about this a couple of times, so you should have this in your head fairly close.
So yeah, so I think the VM, so that you wouldn't have gotten that far if the VM was off. So I don't think it's C. And I don't think you would have gotten this far if Sonia hadn't installed the log analytics agent. So I believe Sonia needs to install that dependency agent.
That is indeed correct. Okay, so in this particular session, we talked about how to enable Azure Monitor for VMs, how to monitor an Azure VM with Azure Monitor, how to enable Azure Monitor in hybrid scenarios, how to collect data from a Windows computer in a hybrid environment, and how to integrate Azure Monitor with System Center Operations Manager. Shannon, where should people go?
So head here to the short URL, the aka.ms link. You can complete the interactive learning exercises, watch videos, and practice and apply your new skills. So that's one place to go in order to learn a little bit more.
Excellent. And you can also learn more by going to these links. These slides will be available later on. Thank you very much, Shannon. It's been absolutely wonderful to work with you. And good luck, everybody, on your learning journey, and enjoy the rest of your Ignite.